Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Mark Turi, and as I say at the head of every single episode that we do here, please like this video if you haven't already, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I am getting more and more watch hours. So, in case you have come to my channel, please note that I have a playlist, a bunch of playlists, in fact, on my playlist area of my channel. And I would really, really appreciate it if you watch some of those videos on my playlists. If you just click one and let a bunch more run, that would really help on my public watch hours. I'm about 500 away, roughly, from actually getting monetized, which would be really, really nice if I could get that as soon as possible. Would really help me out, and I really appreciate it quite a bit. But again, please like if you haven't already. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to share the video on any kind of social media, that's also fine. You can do that too if you would like. Um, this week, and before we get to sort of the um, what I've been kind of doing. Actually, one moment I've been here over here. Hi, Shell. How are you? It's very nice. I know I wish you a happy birthday, but happy belated birthday as well. And yeah, I appreciate you very much being here. We also have Huckleberry. Oh my gosh. Huckleberry, if you had come last week, and I'm not saying you should have because I don't know your schedule, we literally would have had all of my Mark Postles in the same room, and I like to think like do I don't know if you remember the Power Rangers. Maybe it's not in your generation, but the Power Rangers, each one of them, they would get together to form the Mega Power Ranger, and that's how I think when we come to the Mark Postles. Of course, Shell is number 5, and Huckleberry, you are number 6. That's how I kind of think about it. We all come together and form a larger version of ourselves. Yeah, absolutely, Shelley. Yeah, that's really cool. I hope you had a great time. I don't know if you celebrated or what. If you did, if you're comfortable, let us know what you did. But yeah, if you went out for dinner or you just hung in, whichever. But I do hope it was a great day. Don't know if you worked on your birthday. I've done that before, but it is what it is. And yes, here's my twin. There you go. It's okay. As I say, it's all good. Um, I think we've only had all of the apostles on once, so maybe for the sake of the universe, we should all be spread out. Maybe maybe it's not a good thing that we're all in the same place at once. Hey, Peter Anderson, how are you? We got number 4, number 5, and number 6 here today. I haven't been able to recruit anymore, so I think we're just gonna have 6 Mark Apostles, and that's fine. That's more than I thought. I did about 6 more than I ever thought I would have. So there you go. Um, of course, yeah, as I mentioned just earlier, just at the start of the video, yeah, this week again was very hot, but now it's September, so now we're in the middle of September, and so the temperature is cooling down a bit. It's been, I guess I would say, in the low 70s, maybe high 60s, low 70s. For our American friends, probably anywhere from, I don't know, maybe around 20 degrees. I can never remember if 20 degrees is like 70 or 72 or even 75, but regardless, it's sort of in that area. So it's actually pretty comfortable and pretty nice. I think I mentioned last week. Yes, I did mention last week that I took a day trip to Slovakia, which was really cool. I hope to do a couple of other like little day trips like that because it's close in Hungary. That day trip only took an hour and a half by train, which was really nice. And yeah, it was really really cool. Let's see here. Got a couple more things. So Chelsea, I worked. I work tomorrow, so I spent the day getting ready. Okay, to leave, but I will celebrate the next day off. Good. That's very really really good. That's nice. But yeah, working, yeah, work comes first, unfortunately, right? No rest for the wicked, as they say. Maybe we should all meet up with an Egyptian's scarabs, right? Scarab and chickens, yeah, to cast a spell and chill down the issue. Yeah, yeah, we could do that. I think definitely a group of 7 people uh, will absolutely make everything chill. Yeah, geopolitical in Hungary. The NATO action, well, Hungary is a part of NATO, but we're also the government is very pro-Russia, and so I'm sure you guys would have heard, or y'all would have heard that there were some Russian drones that were shot down in Poland, and of course Poland is very. I lived there for a year, but regardless, they're very, very nervous about Russian encroachment and they have a very pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian government. They also border on Belarus, which is very pro-Russia, and they also border on Lithuania. I don't know if you all know, but a few years back, um, there was an election in Belarus. They've had the same leader since 1990, I think, or 92, whenever they were, um, uh, well, whenever they gained independence. They've basically had the same leader, Alexander Lukashenko. But the opposition, there was an election, and there was a young woman, and she actually probably won the election, or at least whatever, and she fled to Lithuania. So yeah, they're in a very precarious position. And of course, we border Hungary borders, a very small border, but we do have one with Ukraine. But again, we are pro, or at least the government is pro-Russia. So yeah, it's interesting. Here, I met a friend of mine, actually from Israel today, and we were sort of talking about everything. And there's quite a few countries in Europe that are, pretty peaceful, pretty removed from a lot of this kind of stuff. I'm sure there also are places like anywhere in the world, in the U.S. and Canada and all over the place, where it's more, and you're more, maybe more in the country, or even if you're in a city, but you kind of seem a little bit far removed. So it's actually really nice. But yeah, Hungary is part of NATO, so and it's been part of NATO, I believe, since 2004. We are part of the EU, of course, since around the same time, maybe 2000. I think maybe we officially joined in 2006 or something, and then officially became part of the free border in 2010. And so, yeah, we technically have to follow those particular standards and things like this. So it's really something. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and it seems even more because we're so inundated, not just with news, but we're also inundated a lot with commentary from online. You can't go onto social media without being bombarded by all these different types. I sort of think that had there been social media even like during World War II, there's a lot going on then as well. I mean, the Allies were in North Africa, Italy, Europe. There were battles in World War II, in the Eastern Front, and the Pacific was brutal. So I think we live in a time where news and information is just overwhelming. So you should know that if we had social media, 2,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, it would probably be very similar. Just the way we are as people, how we get information and so forth. It's not something that's our brains really wrap our head around. There's just a lot going on. But it is, they say, I think there's an old saying that says, like, may you live in exciting times. So we are, which is, I guess, cool. I don't know. Maybe boring times is better. I have no idea. Um, our marine water temps are up to 7 right now, which is hellacious. Marine water temps. So that would be the temperature of, would it be like ocean is marine, or would that be like lakes and rivers as well? Because is that pretty high? Again, I don't know. You have to forgive me. Huckleberry. I know you have a lot of different. Um, Everybody has a lot of different skill sets than myself, especially with this kind of stuff. Yeah, let me know. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that high? I know oceans are rising due to climate change and stuff like this. Venice, a lot of their canals sometimes get flooded. We have floods every year in Hungary. I think it was last year the Danube flooded, and I went over to see the flooding in the Danube, and it was really something. I mean, again, not like it was flooding for several miles in each direction. It was maybe flooding for some feet in each direction, but there were certain like parts around we have a tram near the river, and like the whole tram was completely sunk, and then we have these underground passing through tunnels that go under the tram, from one side to the next, and they were all flooded out, and that was at least a week, um about a week, and it's really strange. And then these villages that are on the Danube, when they get flooded, their economy basically gets destroyed, and they get mudslides and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's pretty cray cray, as they used to say back in the day. Um, but yeah, I mean, a lot of news going on, guys. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in the United States. I'm no expert here. Um, and I'm not saying anybody wants to hear my opinion on political violence, but just know that I don't have to agree with someone or someone's position. I think any form of political violence is disgusting. I think the fact that a lot of it's happening in the United States is really disturbing. Um, no matter what your views are, no, it doesn't matter to me. You know me. I'm like, I guess, center left, right? I belong to the Social Democratic Party, but there's also issues that I'm more moderate and even more cynical than certain people. But I have friends on all sides of the political spectrum, and it's just so terrible when people resort to horrific violence, no matter what you think of the person, no matter what you think of their views. We can think that someone had reprehensible, horrible views, but to have a political violence, and then you see a lot of these surveys that are coming out from Gen Z, who are like 40, sometimes 40 to 45% of Gen Zs believe that political violence is justified. That doesn't happen overnight, and it's just it's gross. I'm sure all of us, I mean, I'm a millennial. I'm an older millennial. Sure, some here might be Gen X or even older. Maybe some people listening to this are younger than me, but to me, as long as we all agree that violence is bad, and that discussing and talking is better, and peace is better than violence, that's to me a very human thing. I don't care what you believe in, but it's rough, let me tell you. It's awful. But Huckleberry says, let me just do one thing here, sorry. Ocean temps are 7 degrees higher than normal, yeah, which is a severe, marine heat wave. 7 degrees in water can be catastrophic to an ecosystem that is often heat or light sensitive. Oh, and I'm sure it's also the aquatic life, right? Um, oh, it's terrible. It's very gross, and the celebration of it is equally disturbing. Yep, I 100% agree with you there, Peter. It's absolutely disgusting. Yeah, political violence is gross. Um, you know, it's, again, I can find somebody and their views absolutely reprehensible, offensive, disgusting, vapid, horrific, nonsensical, illogical. But like, that's where we have debate. That's where we have discussions. That's where you try to say to a person, okay, I see where you're coming from, but here's my position. Is there any common ground? Okay, you believe in this, I believe in that, but what's the middle? And this is what I'm sort of trying to do in the channel. Obviously, you know, is to be respectful. And as I say, I don't care who people vote for. I don't care what your political identities are. I don't care what political parties you belong to. What I care about is how we communicate with each other. And if we are curious, right? No anger, no fear, no bad mouthing, no racism, no, any form of discrimination. We just have these conversations and we just try to learn. And as long as you're doing that, and I don't care what you believe in or who you vote for, it doesn't matter to me, to be completely honest. And this is why I'm upfront when I say, like, I'm center left. I belong to a social democratic party. So maybe some people don't agree with that, but that's okay, right? That's why I want to be open and tell you where I come from and things like this. A similar person, formerly in law enforcement, went to a UC, University of California, near me. Um, Near me, a mob attacked their presentation, and the university just watched. Yep, university police. Social democrat as well, but I think so many people have forgotten the large number of political assassinations occurred in the 60s. Yeah, very, very much. You're right. The Kennedys, that's right. Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles, of course, John F. Kennedy in Texas, in Dallas. Yep, Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was someone whom I would consider to have, and I'm not an expert in this, but I would consider that, especially the Nation of Islam, they have some pretty anti-Semitic, views, which obviously are offensive to me. But does that warrant an assassination? No. Martin Luther King Jr., I think, was wonderful. I think his message was unbelievable. I think he changed way for the better your country. Should not have been assassinated. And then you have to remind me, Medgar Evers. I've heard that word. And the 3, right? The Miss 3? What's that, the forgive me on those ones. I've heard Evers, I'll have to look that person up. Anyway, regardless, yeah, you're absolutely correct. The 60s were full of that stuff. And what does it do? You know what I mean? Like, what did it do? Like, it doesn't do anything. Anyway, I don't wanna get, too much away from our, regular topics here, but those are just some of my 2 cents, and I know, um basically, it's just I know a lot of people are pretty disillusioned, and it's a topic of joy, a topic and so forth, and it's been in the news. It was news here. It made national news here. It made national news over the world. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. But regardless, again, the message of peace is a much better message than political violence. It's just not how we solve things. And I swear, I really hope the Mississippi 3. Oh, yes. So remind me, was that the Mississippi burning case? I think, yes, I think they were. 2 of them were Jew if that's the case, 2 were Jewish, and 1 was an African American man, and yeah, they were a young man, and I've seen the movie multiple times. When Gene Hackman passed away, I watched Mississippi Burning, and, yeah, 2 Jewish students and 1 African American college student helping, yeah, young black men and women and so on register to vote, and they were murdered. I mean, it's disgusting, absolutely horrific. Okay, we're gonna take a little turn. Definitely put comments again or any questions that you want and concerns and things like this. I'll respond to them afterwards. But we do have a topic for today. And that topic is the many varieties of theological stances. Also, forgive me a little bit. I hear some crackling. I had to put in a cough drop last week, for example. My voice was getting a little bit dry. My throat was dry. And so the last, like, kind of 10 minutes, I was kind of struggling. I didn't have cough drops, but so I do now. So if you hear a little thing going back and forth, it's just that. I've been continuing with some of the presentations that I did with the Nerdy Bunch about 2 years ago. As you know, we started off playing those clips that I clipped out of the larger episodes, but I thought for like last week when we did a religion introduction to religious studies, I had the actual PowerPoint. I have the PowerPoint today, and then the last two we're going to do has to do one has to do with the history of Romania in the 20th century, and then another one has to do with the history of Romanian language. We'll close all that out as I still have, of course, these PowerPoints. So I will present the PowerPoints as I would normally do, and then we're going to do a bit of a switch. And I'm thinking of going just to do maybe some PowerPoints like once a month, like I did before, and then we'll do like a weekly topic, and we'll go back to voting for the topics and stuff because I know you all like that. So until that time, let me put up the PowerPoint. And please note, of course, that for whatever reason, when I have my slides at full screen mode, I cannot see the chat. So, and why I have to put this in full screen mode is because, of course, everything is small and my vision is not great. So I have to, of course, read like this, and I want to read everything. So what I normally do is go back and forth. So again, if you have any questions along the way, you have any comments, you have any thoughts, you have any opinions to share, you have anything at all, please put it live in the chat. And as I said, we'll wait for a moment, maybe 5 minutes ish, or maybe every slide or two, and then I'll go back. So right now I'm going to go into full screen mode. So again, once I'm in full screen mode, which I am right now, I can't see the chat, but definitely still comment. um, and so on. And also, if you're just joining us, I might take a second to put up your messages. But anyway, so um, 2 weeks ago we talked about the many different varieties of non-theistic religions and secular philosophies. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week, or two episodes ago, last week we talked about an introduction to religious studies, where I emphasized a lot of those. So, two episodes ago, we talked about like the difference with religious humanism and Buddhism and Confucianism, and they sort of tied into the idea of non-theistic religions, secular philosophies, whatever. How I got started on all of this was because I kind of find it a little odd when someone will say, "Do you believe in God?" And you say yes, you're automatically a theist or a theist. And if you say no, you're automatically an atheist. And then they ask, is there a God? Um, or something like this. And then you're supposed to say yes, you're Gnostic. And if you say no, you're agnostic. It's certainly fine if people want to believe that. I'm not going to fight that. Um, it obviously rings true for a lot of people, but it really never did to me. And so I wanted to make the definition and everything a little bit more. And so I'm taking a lot of these isms that we're going to talk about, these different theological stances. I'm taking them from dictionary definitions, big dictionaries like Merriam-Webster's and Oxford English dictionaries, the most scholarly ones, and then philosophical dictionaries. So that's going to be a little bit more complicated, and we're going to venture out, and we're going to think beyond just one group is theism, one group is atheism, and we're going to talk about different types, different styles, and so forth. But before we even get to that, we have to talk about what is theism. And so, theism, again, colloquially speaking, in popular culture, in some atheist circles, it's just okay, the belief in God. You believe in any kind of God, then you're a theist. However, there's a little bit more to this. Um, so yeah, theism is the belief in a god or gods. But that concept of God or gods has a couple of different characteristics that will differentiate these groups of beliefs with others. So the first thing is when someone is, a theist, they don't just believe in any kind of God or gods. They believe that God is personal, and a personal God or gods are God or gods that hear human prayers. So you literally have a personal relationship. That's a Christian term, but you have a personal relationship with a God or gods. So you pray, the God or gods will hear them, and so forth. And we can come up with many different conclusions after that, whether those gods hear you and intervene or not. That's up to interpretation. But that is the first characteristic. The second is that God or gods will interact with the universe. That's again the idea that this is personal. So there's some interaction. Okay, the concept of God or gods controls aspects of destiny. We've talked about determinism, excuse me, and predestination and determinism before on this channel. So some people have a theological determinism. Many religions believe that even before you're born, God has kind of mapped out your entire life, and you're just sort of going through the motions. And some religions will say that even if you're saved is based on your predestination. So whether or not you're going into heaven, okay, has already been determined before you were born. There's two other characteristics that when we talk about theism that are also attached to that. One is that usually God or gods are corporeal. That means they have a form or a body. This is the opposite of incorporeal, which means they're formless. So if we think of God as a human, okay, that is a corporeal God, and again, emphasizing something that is anthropomorphic. So God or gods look like human beings, okay? So when I'm talking about theism, I'm not just talking about anything, I'm talking about something specific. So the belief in a god or gods that are personal, they interact with the universe, they control aspects of destiny, they have a body and a form, and they may look like human beings. And this is going to separate from other, which I'm going to get into obviously in this presentation, but this separates different forms of theism. So it's not just nebulous; it's specific. So the first, of course, is let me just go back here. Oh, there's a movie that has turned into a series title called God's Not Dead. I've heard of that before. It's very interesting, Pete. Very interesting. Hey, Clearwater Chad, how are you? Here's another PowerPoint presentation that you were around for. As I said earlier, I go into full screen mode. I can't really see the chat, but I always appreciate you being here, Chad. And let me know when you're back from vacation so we can do a uh, a Pete Griff showdown. Okay, going to go back to full screen, so I will see the comments in a few minutes. Um, but of course, right? We once we sort of say in the philosophy of religion, once you ask the question, is there God or gods? Someone says yes, and they go back to this, and okay, they believe in a personal God, and so forth. And then the next question that you get into in the philosophy of religion um, is how many gods are there, right? So this is literally the number of gods that exist, and the reason why I put the picture here on the right, God looking like an old man in the clouds, is because this is a very stereotypical view of the personal God, right? There's this big giant who lives either in the clouds or in heaven, looks obviously has a body and a form, looks human, and has some control over destiny. If we're thinking about Greco Roman religion, Zeus Hades, Saturn, and Mars, whether they were gods male or goddesses female, they also were anthropomorphized, and they were more than one of them, on Mount Olympus or so forth. Um, but that's for the next slide. And this one, okay, when you ask someone, well, how many gods do you believe in? And they just say one, then obviously they are a monotheist. So you say, okay, they say, okay, yes, I believe in a God who's personal, God that has a body, God that has a form, etc. But you believe in one of them. And of course, monotheism is simply the belief in the existence of one deity or the oneness or uniqueness of God. So sometimes a lot of people will ask, like in my own religion, in Judaism, we're said to believe in one God, which is what we call monotheism. But I would argue we believe in the oneness of God, which is a little bit different. However, that might be semantics for some people. But certainly, we have a lot of monotheistic religions on earth, like I mentioned. Judaism is one, Islam is one, Christianity is one. Obviously, depending on whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, there might be the Trinity, but still, they're still monotheistic. Sikhism, the Baha'i faith, is monotheistic. So there's quite a lot of monotheistic religions in the world that have a lot of followers. When it comes to different interpretations of Judaism and Islam, that's going to come later. Um, because monotheism can also be like different forms of theism that we're getting into. There are combinations. So I'll get into that in a moment and give you my own belief about a different ism that, in my opinion, is maybe closer to the Jewish God and the Islamic God. But regardless, you say you believe in God, you say you believe that God has those characteristics from the previous slides, and there's only one. So now there are different types of monotheism. There are a lot of different ways to look at this one God. And here we have excuse me, we have three different types. So the first type here within monotheism is exclusive monotheism. This is a belief that I believe that a lot of um, maybe more conservative leaning Christians, even Jews and stuff like this, would probably believe. So, exclusive monotheism is the belief that there's only one deity and all other claimed deities are distinct from it and false. So, now think some of you might have grown up in a church or a specific type, whether it's Christianity or another religion, probably mostly Christianity, who may have had this view. And why I'm saying that is, you know, what would your church have thought about Saturn, Hades, um, Zeus? Well, they would have said that it doesn't matter to them. Those gods were false, but the one God that we believe in is true. And again, they would be probably more exclusivist. So think of conservative Protestants. I'm not really too sure about Catholicism because Catholicism can have a big wave of different social beliefs, but at least specifically like evangelicals and so forth, this might also be again in like Orthodox Judaism. This could be definitely in certain parts of Islam where there is no God but Allah, for example. So they tend to be more exclusive. But the next one is inclusive monotheism. I would see this as more of a liberal and more mainline and liberal Christian tradition. And so inclusive monotheism is the belief that there's only one deity and that all other claimed deities are just different names for it. So this would also be liberal Judaism. Like, for example, some people would say, okay, something like Zeus or Saturn or whatever, okay? The exclusive monotheist says, no, they're not real. They never were real, but our one God is real. Okay. An inclusive monotheist would just say, hey, listen, we believe in one God, but human beings had to express their religious, beliefs in different ways. And most of us started off as polytheists, which I'm going to get into, but we've gradually evolved to a monotheistic view. But we don't necessarily say that those are wrong. We just say that those different deities like Saturn and Zeus and so forth, they were all still a part of our one God. They were just another expression. So again, more of a liberal idea. But then there's also monolatry, which is really interesting. So monolatry is the belief in the existence of many gods, but with the constant worship of just one deity. And one example of this is something from early Judaism. So the Jewish people or the Hebrew people descended from a group of Semitic peoples called the Canaanites. Like most people in the world, they had a theistic religion, right? They had many gods, like Baal, for example. I think that's the name. Anyway, regardless. And okay, when the Hebrew people first started considering worshiping our God, which we call Yahweh, which I'm really not supposed to say out loud, but I just did. Um, we didn't necessarily say that other, Canaanite groups and other groups in the Levant couldn't have their own gods. We were just going to worship one. Now, of course, that evolved, and it evolved into exclusive monotheism or inclusive monotheism, depending on if you're Orthodox, conservative, reform, etc. But originally, we took one of those gods that were in the area and we started to worship that one, but we didn't say that there weren't any. And again, even though that changed, it's still a pretty interesting type thing. So monolatry is quite an interesting, aspect of monotheism as well, because you're just worshiping one, but you say, well, other gods could exist too. Continuing on the numbers, some cultures, for example, some cultures in Europe and indigenous cultures may be what are called bitheistic. Of course, mono means one and bi means two. And bitheism is simply the belief in two gods. Now, the photo in this slide is actually from a pagan group in Scandinavia, and in this group, they worship, as you can see here on the left, they worship one male god and they worship one female goddess. So many times, bitheists, their gods have maybe different genders or different sexes. So they could take the form of one male, one female, but they can also take the form of having a god that is good versus a god that is evil. The early Gnostic people believed this. Have you ever heard of Gnostic groups, Gnostic Christians? They did believe that there was a heavenly God that was spiritual and that there was an earthly God which was material, and that the earthly God was evil and the heavenly God was good. And some of these groups were Christian and they overlap with that. There's also the light and dark. I know the yin yang is they're not gods, the yin yang, but let's imagine that there was a light uh, um, god and a dark god. And then as it says here, it can be male and female. But the whole thing is there's two of them. They may have opposite morality. They might have opposite uh, good versus evil. They might have opposite genders or sex. But in the end, there are two. And there were many cultures in the world, like the Gnostics and this particular group in Scandinavia, that simply worship two. So that's bitheism. We then get into polytheism, and before I do that, I want to see if there's any comments here. One of the watchmaker analogy, which is theism without. So I'm going to get into that absolutely 100%. We're going to get into that, as that's called deism, and we are going to get into deism. Hello, Chad, Apostle number one, and our Judas. Right. First commandment is thou shalt not, only worship one God. What it doesn't say is that other gods could exist, but it says to worship one. Interpreting LRH's source would be a violation of the first commandment. Yes, it would. And that's why when Scientologists tell you you can be any religion, including Scientology, plus a Christian, plus a Jew, or whatever, they're completely lying to you. They just want your money. Okay, back to full screen. Polytheism again, this is the belief in multiple gods. And this does not only cover um, the pre-Christian Europeans, the Romans, the Greeks, Slavics, Turkic peoples, Hungarian peoples, but also in the Middle East and so on, and even in to some extent in Asia and other continents amongst the indigenous peoples, North, South America, Australia, etc. So these gods are usually distinct and separate beings, and they're often seen as humans, so anthropomorphic in their personality traits, but with additional individual powers, abilities, knowledge, and perceptions. You might know in some cultures there's a sun god, there's a moon god, there's a god of the rain, god of the sea, there's a god of laughter, there's a god of love, there's a god, and there's also could be simultaneously also a goddess. The photo here on the right is of a pantheon. So the pantheon is essentially all of the gods gathered together in in a particular order. And again, in the Greek times, Zeus was at the top, so there was a hierarchy and so forth. That is more European, but definitely there are polytheists and outside of European traditions. I will say some people will consider Hinduism to be polytheist. It kind of is, it kind of isn't, but we're going to get into that in the last example here. But there are different types, for example, of polytheists. So there's what's called hard polytheism, and this is the belief in many gods and goddesses, which appear as distinct and independent beings, often in conflict with one another. And this example would be of the Greco Roman religion. They are hard polytheists. So each god is an individual, each god is separate, they represent something else, and they're often in conflict. The gods were always in conflict with each other in Greek and Roman traditions. There's then soft polytheism, is the belief in many gods and goddesses, which are manifestations or aspects of a single god. In this case, we could also include Hinduism, because in Hinduism, they do have multiple gods, many different gods, but they too have something like a trinity. So they have Brahma, the creator, excuse me, Brahma, the creator, Shiva, the destroyer, Vishnu, the maintainer. However, there's the concept of what's called Brahmin, which goes even far beyond. It's a transcendent, um, incorporeal being. And so, in this case, you could say that Hinduism is, and I'm going to get into some of those aspects on what is a transcendent if it's not not corporeal, it doesn't look like a human. It could still be considered, is it theism? Is it it's something different? We're going to get into that. But then also, what could um, describe Hinduism? And again, it depends on the tradition of Hinduism. It depends on the person in some cases. But there's something called henotheism, and it's the devotion to a single god while accepting the existence of other gods and without denying that others can worship other gods. So here we see a kind of nuance between monolatry, soft polytheism, and henotheism. And so, because they all have different definitions, they all sound kind of similar, but they have these really nuanced approaches. And again, it really depends, you know, some of the things that we're talking about today may not necessarily be very well defined among certain individuals, groups, religious groups. Like, for example, when I mentioned exclusive monotheist, Sure, evangelicals are exclusive monotheists, but I don't think they've ever heard that term. Not to say that they are somehow um, unintelligent, can't hear that term, but it's not an active term because it's probably something that they are, but they don't really know the term. And again, these are the types of things and examples as very similar in Hinduism. Now, before I get to that, yeah, the movie Dogma, really, really great movie. I love that one. That's correct. They use Canadian musician Alanis Morissette to play in the role of God at the end of the movie to debunk, in part, the male role. Yep, such as Charlton Heston. Uh-huh. Great movie, by the way. Fantastic, hilarious. I love the movie Almost an Angel with Paul Hogan. Well, I don't think I've actually seen that one before. The dream he has where Charlton Heston comes to him as God is hilarious. Well, I'll put that on my list. Thank you so much, Peter. That's really fun. But Dogma is a fantastic satire. Um, South Park does a lot of good religious satire, as does Monty Python. I love all that stuff too. Another cough drop. Okay, so what happens when somebody believes in a god or in the concept of a god, but they don't fit into theist? This is an alternative view. These are called non-theistic views of God. Okay, and why are they called non-theistic views of God? Is because while people can still believe in a God, they can also have, throughout the years, have defined the term differently. God is not just some supernatural man or many people. God can is a word, so God can mean essentially anything. And this is where a lot of times skeptics, atheists, again, not to separate, but it happens where people will say that these are all forms of atheism, in that, theist versus atheism. But it's also odd because obviously you can't really be an atheist and believe in a God, but some people have defined God only as supernatural. So then if you don't believe that God is only supernatural, then you're an atheist, but then you still believe in God. And so this is where I want to sort of separate and make these different viewpoints. And again, nothing personal attack on anyone. These are just things I've heard from other people throughout the years. It might not be what you believe in, it's totally fine. But again, these are just things that I hear or have heard. So, what is a non theistic view of God? Well, in this case, the number one thing is God is not personal. So, a non theistic view of God does not hear prayers. Okay, God does not interact with humans or nature. So this is impersonal. God does not have a body or a form, meaning God does not look like a human. God does not have a gender, and God does not watch us all day, every day. So when you know about these things, well, this is what non theistic means in this case. 2 weeks ago, or two episodes ago, we talked about non theistic religions. That just meant that they didn't espouse a belief in God. The reason I put the dash there is to separate those two things. I don't want it to be semantics, but I just, you know, did that because non-theism can be a group that just doesn't espouse belief in a god, but if it's a religion like Buddhism, ethical culture, etc. But if it's a view of God, then these are the tenets. So think of the opposite of what we learned before. Think of the opposite of God as a giant supernatural man or many gods who live somewhere else in a different dimension. These are impersonal, they're incorporeal, they maybe work within the laws of nature, so they're not supernatural. Maybe they're transcendent, but not supernatural. And definitely are they, is God he or a king or whatever? It's more neutral that way. So the first one we're going to talk about is deism. Deism is very important to American history, very important to the Enlightenment, and it's basically the belief that one God exists. So there's an overlap here with monotheism in some cases. However, that God does not intervene with the world and does not intervene with human life or the laws of nature. So while we could say, okay, it is kind of monotheistic, it also isn't, because again, it's a non-theistic view. So this is where we get to the blind watchmaker, where God creates the watch and sort of lets it tick, lets it go. Right? There's a metaphor, which is, if the universe has been around for like how many billions of years? 8 billion or something. Maybe God has gone on to another project, and the Earth is just one of his many projects. And if God does intervene with something, it's within the laws of nature. It's not supernatural. And so this was a very radical belief in the 18th and 19th century. As I said, many of the founding fathers of the United States were deists. They believed in this impersonal view of God. And very a lot of trouble with people saying that this is either a form of theism or atheism. But of course, it's been accused of both. Now, there are different types of deism. We have classical deism, which again goes back to the Enlightenment. This is the view that God is separate and distinct from the universe. But we also have modern deism, and this is the view that God does not live in our universe, but may also interact with it on some level. We then have neo deism, neo means new, and that's the view that God is not earth centric, but rather the first cause of evolution of the Big Bang. And we have our first combination of isms, which is polydeism. And this would be the belief that there are multiple impersonal gods, which could be related to some forms of Buddhism. Because in Buddhism, they have the concept, as I mentioned 2 times ago, that they have the concept of devas, which some cultures call gods, but these devas are mortals, they're imperfect, and they really don't interact with people. So if you want to call Buddhist certain parts of Buddhism polytheistic, which some people call Mahayana parts of polytheistic, I think it would be more polydeism in my opinion. And that's just my opinion. Oh, right. Okay. So let's go back here. All right. The next one is called pantheism. Pantheism, in this case, pan means all. So let me see what it's a little cut off. I apologize. I should have ran it through again, but whatever. I'll get to the mistake in just a second. But pantheism, as we see from the photo here on the right, is all. So all is God. So God and the universe in this case are the same. Some people, like Richard Dawkins, says that pantheism is nothing more than sexed up atheism. Certainly, there is a type which I'll get into, which I think that might um, be true for, but I don't think all the other types of pantheism are. So again, pantheism is the view that God is equivalent to nature or the physical universe, that they are essentially the same thing, or that everything is of an all encompassing, and it should just say immanent, that T should be in the other immanent, abstract God. One of the first people to put this together was a gentleman from the 16th, 17th century called Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza is one of my personal favorite philosophers. Uh, he was a Sephardic Jew whose ancestors were expelled from Portugal in 1497. That was the Portuguese reconquest. And he was born in Amsterdam. And he was one of the first people to put this together. And in fact, there have been a lot of proponents of what are called Spinoza's God. many of which are called atheists, including Gene Roddenberry, Carl Sagan, and Albert Einstein. So again, were they atheists, or hiding their atheism, or were they, pantheist, which is just a belief, in an impersonal type God that is the same as the universe? Well, we have to understand that there are different types now. Okay, so we have four of them now. So classical pantheism, this is of Spinoza, at least originally of Spinoza. And this is the belief in a personal, conscious, and omniscient God. And they see this God as uniting all religions. Now, again, when it says personal here and conscious, it's a little bit tricky. Remember that pantheism, like all things, have evolved. So sometimes these definitions didn't necessarily start off of having a clear sign of what is personal and impersonal. Today, we consider pantheism a non theistic view of God, but originally, right, because there were only personal views of God. And so people like Spinoza and some of the early pantheists did think that the universe and God, there was a personal aspect, different from a monotheist or a polytheist, but still historically part of that. But in the modern world, we basically have these three different beliefs. So pantheism is very um, conscious or aware of what makes the universe. So some pantheists believe that everything is just the universe, but the universe is made out of something spiritual, like an energy, similar in some cases to the Force in Star Wars, to the Tao in Taoism. Those are just imperfect examples, but something like that. Whereas other pantheists, they say, no, the universe itself is just natural. And so God is just a natural thing. And so here we have the difference between monism, which is the metaphysical and theological view, that all is one, that there are no fundamental divisions, and that a unified set of laws underline all of nature. And these are the people who would believe everything is God and everything in the universe is spiritual, as opposed to naturalistic pantheism, which believes that the universe is unconscious and non-sentient, but is also a meaningful focus for mystical fulfillment. And here's where I think you might get away with saying, okay, it's just sexed up atheism, because essentially what you're saying is the universe is natural, so it's not spiritual, but it's God anyway. And there's some mystical fulfillment. So when you walk into the woods and when you're with nature, you might have a sense of awe. So maybe we can call that sexed up atheism. But I don't think we can call that for monism, at least, or Spinoza's God, my opinion. But then we have another combination, which is called pandeism. So now we're combining pantheism all with deism. And it believes that the universe is an unconscious and non sentient God, but that God was previously a conscious and sentient being who designed and created the universe. God only became unconscious and unsentient by becoming the universe. This is a bit of a radical kind of idea. I think it's kind of an interesting thought experiment. So you have like a monotheistic type God that comes around and sort of, I guess, dies or disappears and becomes the universe. And it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, maybe a little psychedelic. But who knows? Maybe that's what happened, right? The original practice of Buddhism was atheistic. The belief in multiple gods was a result of missing access to Hinduism in India. Also, by the way, um, maybe not necessarily atheistic, maybe just in some cases, I would say maybe pantheistic as well. It really depends, though. But you're right, or at least non-theistic. The other thing is that Mahayana Buddhism in China, Korea, and so forth, there were polytheistic traditions, um, and what they call folk religion, which I mentioned last week, is when you combine multiple different traditions. So Mahayana Buddhism is often combined in China with Confucianism, with Taoism, with polytheism, with ancestor worship. And so Mahayana Buddhism definitely becomes more into a polytheistic, maybe polydeistic type thing, but you're absolutely correct. Theravada Buddhism is certainly the most either outright atheistic in some ways, or at least non-theistic in other ways, right? Really depends on the school and the teacher, but you're absolutely correct. Um, they do acknowledge higher beings, but there's those differences where these devas are, subject to the laws of karma. So yeah, very, very interesting comment. So thank you, Huckleberry. But you're absolutely correct about that. Okay, the next one is referred to as panentheism. Pan means all, en in this case means in theism. So instead of all is God, all is in God. And we can see here the picture on the right is God, the universe in the middle. And this is the idea that God is the universe. Here we say the belief that the physical universe is joined to God. So in that case, it's like pantheism. But it also stresses that God is greater than the universe. So they call this God is immanent, like pantheism, but also transcendent. Okay. It is my opinion and my belief that, um, although referred to as monotheism, it is my belief, strictly my belief, in my opinion, that the way Jews and Muslims view God is more like this, that I think there are probably a lot of Christians who may believe this. In fact, I think there's a lot of people in the world who are either deist, pantheist, or panentheist, but may call themselves monotheist because they may actually be a part of a monotheistic religion. However, excuse me, however, there are also people who believe in like traditional monotheism where God is maybe a giant man or something, which is okay. But I kind of side with the idea that at least what we call Hashem and Allah are more like this, in my opinion. Now, there are types of panentheism. The first one is called strong panentheism, and this is the belief that God is not only present in the material world, but that God also transcends the material world. There's weak panentheism. This believes that God is present in the cosmos, but is not identical with it. The next one I would say which is called mystical panentheism. Depending on the school of Buddhism, I think and even Hinduism depending on the school, always depending on the teacher, and depending on the denomination, it may fit. So this is the belief that the material world is an illusion and that there is only one transcendent ultimate reality. They don't call it God in this case. And so when you think of something like nirvana, or as I mentioned before, Brahmin, I think it's more, again, like this. Doesn't mean that all Hindus and all Buddhists are going to necessarily subscribe to this, but certainly in different traditions, maybe in possibly Mahayana Buddhism, possibly in certain traditions within Hinduism, but it's not a one size fits all. And then of course we do have more of an animist or even a shamanistic idea, which is called panentheism. So this is the belief in a God who contains the whole universe, but who is also bigger than the universe. while they also take a hands-off approach to the maintenance of creation. And why I say this might be more shamanistic, this might be more animistic, is because this is actually a belief that many indigenous cultures throughout the world believe in. They sometimes refer to it as the Great Spirit, and they're not polytheists. For example, many indigenous cultures in the First Nations in Canada, Native Americans, are among the Aboriginals and Aborigines. There were also, of course, shamanistic traditions in Korea, Vietnam, Tibet, um, Taiwan, for example. So they're not polytheist like they were in Europe and Central Asia, but they were more nature worship. They believed in the Great Spirit. And I think, again, in my opinion, Panendeism might be one of the oldest versions, considering that a lot of indigenous traditions go back 10 to 12,000 years. So this is a very, very interesting fact, or at least in my opinion, I should say it's a fact in my opinion. In my opinion, get rid of the word fact there, that should should panendeism be closest to the Great Spirit, that the Great Spirit and other associating traditions are most likely older than the concept of polytheism and then monotheism. Again, my opinion. Before I get to that, so the Dalai Lama has embraced his study of quantum physics and how that many that may address and perhaps be the basis of Buddhism. Yeah. I actually really like a lot of the Dalai Lama's books. One of my favorite books from the Dalai Lama, um, and let me look it up here. What is it called? It's stupid when I forget what it is. Oh my lord, why am I forgetting what it is? But I've got it here on Audible, so let me just look through here. But it's a book where he's trying to find a common humanity through different religions. What is it called now? Shoot, it's nice. It's got a red cover. It's a small book, and I don't want to get it. Beyond Religion: Ethics for a Whole World. I think he puts together a very humanistic, religious, even secular humanistic idea where he's saying, let's kind of get people together. What are the common humanities and morality and ethics? And that's a very, very good book. So one of my favorite ones. So yeah, you're absolutely correct about that too. And Buddhism is very, very interesting. Joe practices Buddhism. She's had some trauma with some Buddhist cults or whatever. But I went with her last year to a Sri Lankan Theravada Buddhist temple, which yeah, and I'm always interested in Buddhism. Buddhism is a really, really interesting religion. I think, and this is an odd statement to say because I was estranged from my father before he passed away, but my father also was very closed off. I never really knew what his religion was, which I know sounds a little odd and absurd. My father might have been a Buddhist. I have no idea. I know he practiced it when he was in his 20s because when I was practicing in my 20s, not, I wouldn't even say bonded over it because I never bonded with my dad over anything, but at least we had some kind of connection. Anyway, that's a whole other story for another day. But now we're going to get into the last part of this presentation, which are called alternative views of God and gods. And these are some really interesting ones. And that's why I saved them for last. They don't always fit with theism and they don't necessarily fit with non theism. So you'll understand what I mean. And again, this is why it's complicated. First one, of course, a lot of us are here because we are either critical or against, the Church of Scientology and its abuses. And so, really, technically, I would say um, Scientology, Scientology's theology is extremely nebulous, right? Not really well defined. But the one thing definitely is they believe that people can become godlike through operating Thetan and the OT levels. This is something the closest would be is called autotheism. And so autotheism is the viewpoint that divinity whether it's external or internal, is inherently within one's self, and that one can become godlike. We might even look at the Latter day Saints, the Mormon church, because the idea is when a worthy Mormon man uh, dies, they will become the God or the Heavenly Father of a new planet. Some would also argue the bodhisattvahood could maybe rest within this in Mahayana Buddhism, and some people might even argue Jainism is like this. Again, whether or not they are or aren't is a little bit beyond my pay grade. But if you do believe that there could be an external God or an internal God, but you can become like a God, then that's autotheism. The next one is also a very interesting one. This one is called maltheism or mesotheism or misotheism. In this case, the mal in maltheism means malice. So, maltheism is the belief that a God exists, but is evil, malicious. And misotheism connotes an attitude of hatred towards God. Now, we see in the photo on the right a group of Satanists. And Satanists have a number of theistic and non theistic temples and churches. But one of them, the ones that do believe in worshiping Satan as a supernatural being, do have hatred towards God. They are misotheists. They also might believe that God exists but is also evil. So you can be kind of both or one or the other. But I will say that you know, uh, in the first half of your Bible, which is you guys call the Old Testament, we call the Hebrew Bible. There's a lot of reasons to believe that God is could be pretty evil. There's also people who look at the problem of evil and they said, well, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do children get cancer? Why do animals suffer? Why is there war? And some people may become an atheist or they might question because of that. But there are some people who will just say, well, if God does exist, God's got to be really evil. Not saying that's right or wrong, but they would become a maltheist. A very different approach here, one that we might think is a contradiction. However, this is called omnitheism. Omni means like everything. So, this is the belief that every possible version of God or gods are true and can exist. And it's also the belief that all religions contain a core recognition of the same God or gods. This again can be very like, what are you kidding? It's all contradictory. How can you be a monotheist and a polytheist and all these other groups that we talked about and isms we talked about before? And then how can you be a member of every religion and a believer in every god? It doesn't sound something that I believe in, you know? It's not something I do believe in, but at the same time, there are people who do, and they're not hurting as long as they're not hurting anybody, it might seem contradictory, might even seem absurd. But there is omnitheists, there are omnitheists. I, when doing research for this original PowerPoint presentation, which I did a couple years ago, I uh, I clicked and read an article, an online article with the musician Chris Martin from Coldplay, Chris Martin, and he called himself an omnitheist. And in the article, he said he was a believer in every god and a member of every religion. Again, it can be contradictory. We can call it absurd, but I'll be honest with you, it doesn't seem like people are hurting one another, and that's okay too. So we can say, hey, that's you know, uh, maybe not something I would be, but again, they're not harming anybody, I think. And here's the last one. This is a really really interesting one. The gentleman on the left here is a Christian theologian named Paul Tillich. He was German, I think also American, but regardless. And he came up with the idea of transtheism. Of course, trans means to transcend, to go beyond, or to go above something. So he created this idea that says Transtheism itself is neither theistic nor atheistic, but it's beyond both. It proposes that if God or gods exist, then God or gods go beyond all theologies. So everything I just mentioned, literally, in this entire presentation until now, that the real version of God or gods would go beyond all of our theologies that would be presented by human beings. So there would be a God or gods above and beyond what we could even consider to be real God or gods. And then the last one, which I think is interesting, sounds a little contradictory, I think, in some cases, but regardless, he also says that if God or gods don't exist, okay, then the non existence of God or gods would go beyond things like atheism. So even atheism wouldn't have the full understanding of the entire universe that there would in other secular philosophies that we mentioned last week. So post theism, agnosticism, free thought, and then even non-theistic, philosophies like ethical culture and Taoism and all this kind of stuff. So even those concepts I mentioned last week, if there wasn't any kind of God, then all of those concepts there would be something beyond. And so if you kind of think about it, think of the first part as like, okay, humans have all these concepts of God. But if God really exists, that would transcend all of those things. It would be so far beyond it that all of our theologies are just human centered. But if God didn't exist, really didn't exist, then like atheism, skepticism, secular humanism would also just be human constructs. And they wouldn't be able to necessarily fully define the actual reality of God or no God. So that's Paul Tillich for you. And it's a lot of interesting thinking. And I think it's kind of nice here just to think about this kind of stuff. Um, My wife and I took refuge, at the, Sakyamana Monastery. Where is that? That's really interesting. In 2007, that's really cool. What I practiced Tibetan Buddhism for 2 years, and, yeah, refuge I know is part of the conversion process. Yeah, I know, Shakayana Monastery. That's really cool. Let me know where that is in the world. I'm interested. Some people with large YouTube channels embrace monotheism, also narcissism, so you're not wrong there. Guten Abend. Guten Abend, Marv. How are you? I hope you are good. Good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate that very much. Sorry, Sakaya, not Sayakaya. I got my Tibetan confused. Oh, a Tibetan group. Okay, that's really cool. Again, the group I went to was part of the Karma Kaju lineage. Um, we all are going to look foolish when it comes to light. That this is all a computer simulation. Yeah, yeah, probably it's like The Sims. I was in Seattle. Okay, cool. Yeah. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of Buddhism in Seattle because I know there's a large Chinese and Japanese population. I know that there's quite a few Japanese temples that are there. I studied different types of Buddhism. I've been studied the Soka Gakkai International. I studied Nichiren Shu, which I like quite a lot. I studied Tibetan. Um, I studied what they call Jodo Shinshu, which is Pure Land version of Japanese Buddhism. I also studied Chan Sam, which is the Chinese Pure Land Buddhism, which I found was actually very like theistic, polytheistic. So it really depended on the different branches. Um, Interestingly enough, when I lived in San Francisco and I was a staff member for Scientology, I lived one block from a Shinto group and another block from I think they were either Shingon or Tendai, Buddhist temples, which are esoteric Buddhist groups within Japanese Buddhism. I like Japanese culture quite a bit, so I think they call a Japanophile as what I am. I really love Japanese culture and stuff like that. Anyway, regardless, that's just my thing here. So yeah, in Scientology, they have a Gnostic framework. If Xenu is more like a devil figure, um, who, if anyone has seen the actual creator of the universe. So the thing with Xenu, guys, so it's kind of an interesting thing. I think sometimes people overemphasize Xenu and the role of Xenu in Scientology. I don't think he's a Satan-like figure. I think that story is really, it's like you have to kind of know OT3, and it's a bizarre story, don't get me wrong. It's obviously in Scientology, but I'm not sure if I would compare it to the devil. I think that's a really kind of a false comparison because Scientology is more like a mixture. And again, first of all, they're a scam. They just want your money. But the facade of Scientology is that it's like East versus West. It's Gnostic. It's esoteric. It's all BS. And the stories of Xenu and all that kind of stuff is also just as BS as anything else. It's just Hubbard had to explain why we had body thetans, and he was a science fiction writer. But you're right. I think there's some component maybe that we could make at that aspect, but I don't know if I would call him Scientology Satan. Who knows? Maybe I'm wrong, but I just think that's a little overemphasized. Regardless, who cares? Doesn't really matter. The founder of Sakaya Monastery was the third in line. Oh, to the Dalai Lama. I won't pretend to understand the hierarchy. Oh, don't worry, I don't either. I don't understand anything pretty much. Anyway, with the Xenu stuff, uh, my 2 cents is just how do you get the body thetans? How do you get people to believe in the body thetans? The other thing is, um, before OT3, L. Ron Hubbard wrote a screenplay called Revolt in the Stars, and he was going to make the Xenu story into a major motion picture, and then decided against it and put the Xenu story into OT3. But could you imagine if Revolt in the Stars, which you can Google and you can find a copy of it online? It's somebody in Scientology um, made a copy of it and put it on the internet. If that was an actual major motion picture, so you can read the whole thing if you want. Of course, there's the whole mythology about you getting sick and all this BS. But anyway, it's one of those things where I'm not even really sure what I think about the Xenu story. I guess if I just want to soliloquy before I go, it's definitely there. It's definitely really, really odd. It's definitely very bizarre. It's definitely a part of OT3. It's definitely the story of how we get body thetans. But again, to compare it to the devil or to compare it to the creation story might be giving it a little bit of weight that I don't know if it deserves. I do know people, we have a mutual friend, Doug Scott Kramer, who, by the way, I also about 2 or 3 years ago um, did something very similar. Talked about this subject with him. Um, he did OT3, and his story was more that he felt betrayed. That if that's really what Scientology was, it was a complete betrayal. And to me, that's the abuse. Because I always like to say to people, like, I really don't care about Xenu. You shouldn't have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get there. That's stupid. If that is the creation story, if that is the birth of Satan, why do you have to pay all that money? And again, it's because Scientology is all about money. That to me is the more abusive thing. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. Who cares? Marv just says yes. Let me just see here. Hold on. Um, yes, he's just more, yeah, an antagonist, exactly, who is mandatory for the whole story. Maybe he's a bit Luciferian. Yeah, 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 that's for sure. But there's a creating power Is there a creating power in Scientology? No, there is not. There is no creator in Scientology. So L. Ron Hubbard believed that the Thetans, when they were existing in the spiritual universe, created as a game the material universe, got caught in the material universe, and trapped themselves. This is 100% Gnostic. There is nothing original what I just said, because in the Gnostic traditions, the heavenly good God was playing around one day and created the material universe. And of course, there needed to be a God for the material universe. So that God created the um, material God, and then that God became evil and betrayed the good God. It's the same crap. L. Ron Hubbard was not creative. Gnosticism, which he might have known about through research or whatever, he may have gotten lucky through some dice and just made up these stories that seem like Gnostic tales. Um, but yeah, I don't think he was that smart. What he was smart in was, of course, being a con artist and getting people to give him a lot of money, and then hiding a lot of those stories, like Xenu, in the upper levels and the body thetans, which, there's a huge continuity error in Scientology when you start until when you finish. That's it's just horrific and disgusting. But as far as a creator, there isn't. Scientology is technically a non-theistic religion. It does not espouse a belief in God. Even the eighth dynamic, which I mentioned last week, in the 70s, I had a slide on the five C's of religion. So you can go back to last week's presentation and look at that. Um, One of them they call cult, which they're using as a noun and not a verb, or they're using as a verb, but they're using as a verb and not a noun. And it means to worship or to give reverence. And so Scientologists by the 70s didn't have these C's, these five C's: creed, code, cult, community, and clergy. And they invented it. And so they invented the eight dynamics, but the eight dynamics are not important. The only important one is the third dynamic, which is groups, and of course, Scientology. And fourth dynamic, which is, of course, mankind, not humankind, mankind. But all the other dynamics are pretty much pointless, especially the first dynamic, which is you as an individual, as you don't matter. So interesting. Um, we got a Scientology influencer here in Germany. Really? That says that the Xenu story is just a book of him that wasn't published. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's Revolt in the Stars. And Hubbard alludes to some Xenu stuff. RJ67, Ron's Journal, 1967. There's a lecture called The Free Being, which he alludes. He always alludes. It's always mysterious with him. But that's when you get into that. OT5, of course, is once you get to OT4, you put your thetans through a drug rehab because they've been doing drugs, which is why you were not you couldn't. OT3 could not get all the thetans off of you, and then in OT5, I think you're doing clusters, and and unconscious thetan. Who cares? I mean, and then by the time you're doing 7 again, you're doing all these other. You guys know this. It's like, okay, we get Thetan, body Thetans on 3, on 4 and 5. 6 is a training course. Then we do 7, which is like long. And then by the time you get to 8, you've mocked it all up, and then there's nothing after that yet. So complete scam. Anyway, I just want to go through my conclusion here and just say I believe that when people present, do you believe in God? Yes or no? Is there a God? Yes or no? It's too simple. Maybe I'm overcomplicating it. Fine, but I think it's too simple. You can still be whomever you are, but now I like to give people options. So I understand that there's a lot of things about this kind of thing, and in the end, you might just say, "Oh, well, I'm an atheist," or "Okay, I'm a monotheist," and that's fine. But I still believe that there are nuances. I still believe that there are different theological stances, and that it's up to you as an individual. It's not up to someone who asks you two questions, and whether or not you say yes or no, they put you in a box. It's up to you. And so I will tell you that I have a theological stance. It's not a strong one, but I have one. Which one is it? Well, honestly, I don't want to share only because I don't want to influence anybody else's. So maybe in some time, maybe in a month or two later, I will share it. I'll give you some of my thoughts about it, but of course I can be wrong. And of course, I don't actually know for sure. But I really just like people to go through these last three presentations and figure out as to your own personal experience, to your how you've lived your life, your own background, education, um, culture, personal experience, and think, okay, something that I said, does it ring true? Think about it a little bit if you can. Is there something I said you didn't like, or you might have been contended or whatever, um, uh, what contentious, I guess would be the word. Drop a comment in the comments of the video. And as I said, I'm just trying to present. It's not really about me. It's more about me trying to give more options to people. And I don't know why this bothers me. Maybe it's because it's just the way that I think, and I don't really like the overly, oversimplification of these big issues. And maybe it's not important, and that's okay too. But regardless, I really like these presentations, the last three presentations we've done, and we have two more after this. As I said, there's going to be the history of Romania in the 20th century, and then after that, it's going to be the history of the Romanian language. I mentioned earlier, but I will go. We will go back to probably more once a month. Maybe I'll do a PowerPoint. For example, I want to finish a PowerPoint on some of the issues. Um, uh, what do you say? Some of the things that I did through my thesis. I'm trying to get a copy, an electronic copy of my thesis, which should be published sometime soon on the library of my university. And so I will hopefully get a link to that soon and go over some major stuff. But until that time, I think we'll do the weekly thing where we vote. And you know what? Maybe we'll do a little discussion on violence and political violence, and I'll sort of go through a bunch of stuff. I want to get into things like we talked a little bit about echo chambers, political ideologies, like radicalization. There's a lot of really interesting things that we can discuss, starting, I guess, at the end of this month, beginning of next month. But regardless, everyone, next week is, what is it here? The 20th and then the 27th. So those will be the Romania presentations. So by the time October comes along, we'll go back to the voting. We'll go back to all these other things that we did, before, um, like last year and stuff. So anyway, I thank you everyone for being here. Yes, Irish. It's okay. You can be on another channel. Just tell her to watch the replay if she wants. But she's very loyal. But I understand sometimes too. I'm might conflict with other schedules, but what can you do, right? Um, Otherwise, I think I'd have to go live at like 4 or 5 in the morning when everyone else is sleeping, and I'm not going to do that. So there's going to be time conflicts anyway. Um, but I will see you all next week, please. Again, um, yeah, she just got home from protesting. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Marv. Uh, guten Nacht, Marv. And Peter, yeah, I mean, she comes home from protesting, no big deal. So please like this video if you haven't already. Please subscribe if you haven't. If you want to share this video to other people to get them to subscribe as well. Thank you to everybody here. Right now I'm at 7 people. I know that doesn't sound like much, but to be honest with you, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Even if we have what, a dozen people of regulars that come in and out, I would rather, you know, talk to you all. Hopefully, we'll grow, but you know what? If this is it, I'm still happy. I'm still gonna do the best that I can with the people who are listening. It's remarkable to me that even one person listens, but there's quite a few that do. I'm still at 1,200 plus subscribers. I still got about 500 more hours to go through. So please, if you can, give me some watch hours through my playlists. You can click on one and let them run if you want. Again, please like, please subscribe, and all that good stuff. So we will be back next week with a presentation on the history of Romania, which is a really nice presentation again that I did that I'm going to do like this because I finally have the PowerPoints. And then we will close out the week after with a history of the Romanian language, which I think is really cool. So yeah, so thank you so much again. We say Joi Sokat, which is Hungarian for good night. We have Gute Nacht. We have Buenas noches. There's other ones. Dobranoc is Polish, and on and on and on. So thank you, everyone. I wish you a good weekend. I wish you a good week, and I'll see you next week. And of course, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.